Hey there folks, the number one Joe Cocker fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Review series for 2025. What is the Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking? It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, review one album, just one, by each of them, and then talk about whether I think they should get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and if I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A couple of questions that often have very different answers, more frequently than you would want, trust me. And today I'm talking about none other than the late great Joe Cocker in his debut studio album, With a Little Help from My Friends. Joe Cocker was something of a one-man tribute band, minus, all the musicians that played with him, but I digress, my point still stands. He was the Woodstock generation's go-to man for taking pre-existing popular songs and adding a little bit of vocal flair and intensity that the originals frequently didn't have. And rightfully so. He was one of the premier blues rock vocalists of his era, and the majority of the songs that he covered did not originally have the sort of blues, booze-soaked barroom vibe that he so often brought to the table. He really was a great performer and vocalist, even in his weaker tracks and weaker moments overall. And while his career ended up being pretty spotty overall, especially post-1975 or so, he began to put out some pretty atrocious records. He definitely put out a great couple of records in his early days when he was at his most popular, and while most of his records were, for the most part, filled with nothing but covers, Cocker really makes those songs his own, and he also sprinkles in some solid originals along the way. That's something you can say about most of his early records, and With a Little Help from My Friends is no exception. A good record that, again, heavily relies on covers with an original now and again, but as a whole, he's one of the few artists that can pull off a nearly entirely covers-based album and make it sound like he wrote the majority of them. I mean, as a whole, this is about as strong of a debut that you could really ask for from an artist like Cocker, with the main draw obviously being his vocal work here, which walked the line between bluesy and soaring to really make for a pretty impressive vocal performance here on this record overall. He's certainly one of the most striking vocalists of his era, when popular music kind of didn't really focus on vocal technicality, for the better, in my opinion, as much as it did in the decades prior. But now here we are with Joe Cocker, an artist who really brought a degree of extreme personality behind a stadium-ready voice that felt unique in the context of the hippie generation of musicians. Now, whether or not he always used that voice for good or memorable music, that's up for debate. That's definitely up for debate, again, especially as the years went on, but as a whole, he has a rich, recognizable vocal style that could only really be ignored by people trying to actively forget about his existence or music. I don't necessarily say this that often, but I do think that Cocker, at the very least, has a pretty objectively distinguishable voice, even if you aren't a fan of his music or of his vocal style. And I mean, I think it's pretty understandable if you're trying to ignore his presence in the music industry, again, after like the early to mid-70s, but he was still good at this point, damn it, and this is a good album. I do think that a lot of people going back to this era of music and kind of looking over popular records of the era will probably be driven away from this one and a lot of Cocker's catalog in general, just because of the fact that there is the notion that, hey, these songs aren't as good as the original version, so why should I listen to them? And I mean, that is true. A lot of these songs are far and away not nearly as good as the original versions of them. A lot of these covers just don't eclipse the originals, but at the same time, I also feel like a lot of these covers are so different from their original versions that they are hard to compare. Like, yeah, I prefer the Beatles' version of the title track here, but at the same time, the original With a Little Help from My Friends is a proto-twee-pop song sung by a gremlin-y Ringo Starr in all of his nasally vocal glory, whereas here Cocker is belting it out like an alcoholic karaoke singer who somehow manages to hold a note still. And yeah, I prefer Bob Dylan's sand and glue voice on Just Like a Woman because it suits the song a little bit better, and I prefer the musical backing on that one. But at the same time, Cocker's version isn't a miss either. I just feel like it would be be a little bit foolish to compare covers and versions of songs here, because, like I said before, Cocker really does make a lot of these songs his own. Not necessarily better, but unique from the source material to the point where it doesn't necessarily feel like Cocker just trying to eclipse the originals, or trying to reach the same degree of greatness that so many of the artists that he covered either already had achieved or would eventually achieve. It feels like him just turning songs into his own thing entirely. Though I will say, the only cover here that I actually legitimately prefer over the original is Cocker's version of Feelin' Alright by Traffic, the Steve Winwood-oriented prog jazz influence band that is pretty underrated overall and doesn't really get enough love from music nerds. And honestly, that's just because I have nostalgia for it. I remember hearing Cocker's version before I even knew who Traffic was, or who Steve Winwood was, for that matter. I heard it when I was like 8, so I'm obviously going to have an inherent love for that version over the other original version, which is also great, to clarify. But beyond that, just a personal connection that I have to the song, I don't listen to this record feeling completely blown away by everything that goes on here. It's just a series of really good covers, but as long as you don't directly compare a lot of these versions to some of the massively iconic original versions of themselves, or the originals based on sound alone, then, I think it would be hard to not appreciate just how well a lot of these are executed. Because generally speaking, even when Cocker wasn't necessarily eclipsing the original versions of these songs, he was turning them into something different, and that's just as admirable in my opinion. And as a side note, just kind of talking about the making of this record, this is kind of a who's who of musicians from the late 60s and very early 70s. I mean, of course, Cocker's Grease band, his backing band, is here, as well as some sessions legends like the ever great Carol Kaye, one of the all-time great bassists, in my opinion. But also, you got like Jimmy Page and Steve Winwood himself, who I previously mentioned, as well as Mary Clayton on some backing vocals, who, of course, sang the iconic female lead on the Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter, arguably one of the most mesmerizing vocal performances of all time. Truly heartbreaking, moving stuff on that track in particular that she delivers. So it's just really interesting to see the musicianship here. I mean, it's just solid and sort of jam-like in nature, just really locked in, but never really expanding into greatness or anything super unique from other blues rock and somewhat jam-oriented records of the era. But this record never needed to be anything more musically than that, and I think anything more would have been pure self-indulgence from a group of musicians who were, again, either already on their way to stardom or would eventually make their way in that direction. And I just think that's a neat quality of the record overall, more than anything. Not really something that affects the record in one way or another, it's just a solid album musically, but I thought it was kind of interesting to mention, because I think that outside of a few select notable bands throughout the history of music, this is kind of one of those examples of a single record that just manages to have a pretty star-studded cast of individuals across every single track for the most part. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And that brings me to the question, does Joe Cocker deserve to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And honestly, I mean, I don't necessarily want to completely dismiss Joe Cocker or anything like that as an artist. Again, he was an absolutely astoundingly great vocalist. He didn't always use it for the most interesting music, in my opinion, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm a diehard fan or anything, but I do like a lot of his early work, and even some of his later work is pretty alright, in my opinion. So, as a whole, the guy's got a solid discography. He kept making music for the entire length of his lifetime, and I always have to respect the longevity there, but at the same time, not to be insulting, but in many ways, Cocker's legacy is just being a tribute act in a lot of ways. Not necessarily paying tribute to a specific artist, I don't mean that in the literal sense, but his legacy is just really good covers of other individuals' pre-existing songs, and there's plenty of artists in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who have popular covers of other songs, but that's kind of Cocker's whole thing. I think the average person, even the average Joe Cocker fan, would probably first list a bunch of covers that are either on this record or were on other records before they ever actually got to an original song that he put out. Whether you're looking at covers on this record of people that I mentioned like Bob Dylan or the Beatles, his cover on the follow-up of this record where he covered the Beatles' She Came In Through the Bathroom Window from The Long One on the Abbey Road B-side. Later on on live albums where he covered songs like The Box Tops Is the Letter, etc., etc. And I feel like at the end of the day, that's his thing. That was his shtick, basically. And none of those songs ever really eclipsed the originals in terms of cultural relevance or popularity. They were always just good to great covers of already good to great songs. And because of that, I just can't help but wonder what really the point is. I mean, the guy was an amazing talent, sure, but I just don't necessarily see him on the same level as some other performers and artists from the Woodstock era. And I mean, if you really wanted to continue inducting other bands from that particular era of music, I don't know, I think there are other artists that are just as, if not more deserving in terms of influence, like Love, or even the 13th Floor Elevators, for example. Not necessarily the same musically whatsoever, but definitely from the same era, and I just think that Cocker is a popular artist who's beloved by a few and well-liked by most, and other than that, he doesn't really have a huge legacy going for him, outside of, again, popular covers of other songs where the originals are genuinely more well-known, most of the time, at least. Now, will he get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? I feel like it's a different question entirely. Another example of an artist on the list this year where I have two very different answers for the two different questions I ask at the end of these videos. I think Cocker probably has a good chance of it. I'm not going to say it's a definite, he's not a lock, because there are a lot of artists that I honestly think will probably get a lot of recognition from the Hall within the next couple of years. There are only like one, maybe two artists on the list this entire year that I don't think will get in within the next 5 or so. I genuinely think that this list is filled with nothing but future inductees with a couple of exceptions, and that's a nice thing to see, but it also means that it's kind of a tough ballot. I mean, I don't necessarily know if Cocker is going to be the name on the tips of every voter's tongue, especially when the Hall isn't really the most transparent about who votes, because if it's nothing really for the most part but just voters from the 60s and the 70s who were inducted and are now voting, Cocker might be a definite inclusion, but if it's half and half between that group and critics, most of whom probably have no relationship with Cocker's body of work whatsoever, because really he just is not really considered anything more than a product of his time by most music geeks and most casual listeners alike, then I don't think he's as likely. But I also think it's important to remember that a lot of D-list or C-list at best kind of rock acts from the 60s and 70s have found their way into induction in recent years, the most obvious example of that being last year with Peter Frampton, one of the most marginal inductees that we've had in a while at this point in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And if someone like Frampton can get in, then I don't see why someone like Cocker can't as well, especially with none other than Paul McCartney himself supporting Cocker's induction. Mind you, little late in the game, came quite a few weeks after the initial announcement of the nominees, so I don't necessarily know how valuable that's going to be, unlike when he supported Foreigner last year, and Foreigner eventually got in, of course. When he did that, that was a bit earlier in the nomination cycle, but, you know, still, got backing from Paul McCartney, got a lot of people that grew up with Cocker's music, or were covered by Cocker, who are voting, so I think he has a good chance. Not one of the best inductees here, certainly not among the most influential, arguably one of the least essential nominees on the entire list, but he definitely has a good shot overall, and I wouldn't be shocked to see him on the final list, even if he just barely made it on. With that being said, that is the end of this entry in the Rock Hall Review series. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.